Hey, so I'm back at you, Bicho Feo here with more cheap heat. This edition, I'm sorry to say, is a little less cheap than previous. A little less cheap because we're talking about imported records here. I'm in the US, so imported records are going to be from everywhere else. I don't know about you. When I was a kid collecting records, well, buying records anyway, I would just jet right over to the import section. That's what they had, an import section. That's the amazing thing. I love that. I like the way they felt, I like the way they looked, and usually there's different bands there that I'd never heard of before, and that was really part of the adventure. So, normally one thinks of imports as being more expensive, but, well, they are. But some could be had for quite little, and oftentimes they'll cost you less than the price of postage from some foreign country. So my strategy is to basically buy a brick of them, 5 or 6 at a time. It works out well, especially with the Eastern European stuff. Anyway, without any further ado, I'll get into describing some of the relatively inexpensive imports that I've come across over the years that can still be had for, I'm going to say most of these are less than 20 bucks. There's going to be a few that cost a little bit more. Might require a little bit of luck on eBay or digging, but just good to watch out for, especially if you like jazz rock fusion like I do. That's what all this is about. That's the genre I'm concerned with. We'll get to other genres some other time. Anyway, what we're listening to now is Francois Briand. His first solo LP, Sons Optiques, on the Egg label. And I think this album is absolutely brilliant. There was a follow-up, Voyeur Extra Lucide, which I didn't like as much. This album is great, though. There's just something really charming and ultra mega repeatedly listenable about it. It's more of a progressive rock instrumental type record than it is a jazz record, although what they're doing right now is kind of jazzy. But anyway, it's got a lot of great people on it. Francois Briand was in Nemo and a couple of other groups that are sort of loosely associated with the Magma Circle in France. Didier Lockwood's on this. Jean-Louis Chotemp, a really excellent saxophonist, is on this. So some really great personnel. Definitely some heavy keyboard and synth passages, but it's not really an ensemble record so much, but it's really lovely all the way through. Another record that I find rather charming, but that I've noticed that there's some real detractors from. I've heard people trash this record, but maybe that's why it's so inexpensive, is Joe O'Donnell's album. I can't even pronounce the name of it. ODonnell Vision, something like that. It's got Rory Gallagher on it. I guess that's the main draw for some people, is that it's an Irish-themed fusion record. And basically what you have here are alternating symphonic chamber music pieces alternating with heavy fusion Brand X type stuff. The sound is really actually on the fusion-y tracks quite a bit more like Brand X than anything else. I really like this record, despite the leprechaun factor. I guess another good comparison would be the Marscape record that Lancaster and Lumley did when Brand X had the big recording contract. Anyway, keep an eye out for this one. It's got a nice gatefold cover. It was issued only in Germany. Some of the personnel on this is pretty interesting. Some of these people I've never heard of. But then there's the John Field from Jade Warriors on this, besides Rory Gallagher. And Theodore Thunder on drums. He's like a pretty well-known British session dude. So those are interesting records. Here's an essential record for all of you fusion heads out there that is still rather inexpensive. Friends. And this is an amazing, amazing, hot, super killer fusion record. It's a guitar, saxophone, bass, and drums quartet. Mark Cohen on saxophone, played with 2 wah-wah pedals. So it's pretty out there, the saxophone playing. Subsequently, Mark Cohen changed his name to Mark Copeland and now plays jazz piano. He's now one of the great jazz pianists of our time. Check out his stuff. It's totally different than this. The other people on this are amazing. John Abercrombie on guitar, playing some of his most fuzzed out, freaky freakage ever. Jeff Williams on drums, giving Billy Cobham and Tony Williams a run for their money. And Clint Houston played some really excellent bass on this. This is a crazy record, total energy from beginning to end. You must have it if you like 70s fusion. It is out there. It might be a little bit too out for some guys who are into the more proggy end of it, but it's great. The playing on it alone is fantastic. For whatever reason, even though it was issued in the US, for whatever reason it was not, I mean, it was never issued in the US, I don't think, for whatever reason, even though it's US players. I don't understand these things. It came out on Virgin, or a subsidiary of Virgin. Anyway, moving along, Michele Ripo, best known for his work with Vangelis on Hypothesis and The Dragon, and I think he was also on Earth, as well as maybe a few other LPs associated with Vangelis. Really excellent sort of gypsy violinist. This is a great fusion record, very underrated. No guitar, just violin, bass, drums, and Fender Rhodes piano that sounds a lot like Jan Hammer, but it's another guy. It's Philippe Briesch. I'm going to have to look up more stuff that he's on. And then some tracks have a string quartet, and those are really nice. This is a great fusion record, though. I really like this one a lot. Lots of energy. Again, all-star personnel. I've never heard of Philippe Briesch before, but the drummer is Jean Schulteis, who played with Alan Marcusfeld and does a really nice job, even though he's more of a rock guy. And on bass, it's the one and only Yannick Top from Magma. So really interesting personnel, really excellent playing, and very unique sound. Highly recommended and not expensive at all. This one might set you back a little bit more. It's the follow-up to Equinox, the one I just showed. This is Michele Ripo and Andre Dumais, and acoustic guitar and violin with percussion. And I gotta say, Andre Dumais is an interesting player, very aggressive guitar player, sort of in a McLaughlin mode, only on all acoustic, but really a sort of attacking, sort of fierce player. And oddly enough, Ripo begins to sound a little bit like Jean-Luc Ponty on this for some reason. I'm not quite sure why, but just from Equinox to this, he really changed his style a little bit, I think. And the percussionist is wonderful. This is a great record. It came out in Canada as well as in France, so it's probably a little bit more findable, and might set you back maybe 10, 15 instead of less than 10, but you never know. Really good record, one to watch out for. No bass, no drums, just guitar, violin, and percussion. Here's a record I really don't get why this is so cheap, but I'm glad that it is. Eyeball. It's basically Pork Pie, who released two great records on MPS in the 70s, minus Philip Catherine, plus Didier Lockwood. And anything with Didier Lockwood on it is going to be, in my book, buyable. A lot of Didier Lockwood's later stuff is actually pretty inexpensive as well. His New World record on MPS is not at all expensive. You should check that out with Tony Williams on drums. Anyway, this is a great, more fusion-oriented record than a lot of Didier Lockwood's solo stuff. Of course, the great personnel, you can read it on here. Jasper Van Toff, Aldo Romano. Just a great record from start to finish. You kind of know what you're getting into with these guys. Nothing too out, but definitely some challenging, very dense jazz rock and electric jazz. I really like these guys. These are interesting records. They're done by a guy named Georges Cognate, who's from somewhere in the Caribbean. I believe he is Guadeloupean. They feature all-star cast of supporting players. You can see Larry Coryell, Philip Catherine, I think, is on one of these. Michael Brecker, Calvin Weston from Ornette Coleman's band. Not mentioned on the front is a bunch of Magma associates. Benoit Weidman. Oh gosh, who else? Manu Katché on drums, probably is still a teenager at this time. Patrick Gauthier from Magma, and also Helden. So you get the idea. These are star-studded affairs. And it's funny, Cognate comes on as sort of a selfless player. He's happy to share the stage with his all-star pals. Not a show-off by any stretch, but the dude can play. As with a lot of these sort of all-star type records, the personnel varies from track to track, and some tracks there's like a guitar duet, and then there's a full-on jazz funk fusion thing with horns, and then there'll be like a jazz rock thing with keyboards, guitar, bass, and drums, that kind of thing. It kind of switches back and forth between those different modes. These aren't great records, but they're really good. I mean, they've stayed in my collection for a while, and they won't set you back much at all. And it seems like nobody knows about them. I don't know. A lot of Eastern European stuff goes under the radar, even today. Even though they have compilations with Eastern European tracks on them, you can still find a lot of these things for less than 10, 15 bucks. And again, the approach is, to me, buy a brick of them. Buy 5 or 6 at a time, save on postage. And if you're buying them for like €5 a piece, you're getting a good deal. One of my favorite Eastern European records is this one, Gustav Zeek and his group. It's 2 keyboard players. Zeek is on Fender Rhodes and synthesizer, and then there's a guy playing Hammond B3, and then there's a bassist and a drummer. Really excellent playing, very funky, kind of hyperactive and a little wild and crazy in the whole Eastern European mode. You kind of expect that. All originals, except there's a nice version of Chameleon, believe it or not, one of the better covers of that tune I've ever heard. And they also do Skyscrapers by Deodato, which I actually like better than the original. Really excellent record, and a little bit of a cheese factor creeps in here and there, but still highly recommended. Gustav Zeek, this guy, was in a group called Roundhouse, and they did 2 records, more in a sort of a modern soul, funk, jazz, big band sort of mode. Really interesting records. I don't have them, but they'll set you back 50, 60 bucks probably. This won't cost you nearly that much, and it's really good, much more jazz oriented. Speaking of Eastern Europe, this one was recommended to me by Christopher Cole, and it's great. It's really excellent all the way through. Bulgarian guys, Septet Ruse. And there's copies of this on Discogs, for example, for like €3 that are like VG+. I mean, this is such a great record. It's a little avant-garde. By avant-garde, I don't mean free. I mean avant-garde contemporary classical. There's a bit of that running through some of the pieces, but for the most part, like 90% of it is really interesting, plugged in electric jazz and jazz rock fusion. Really good. Interesting lineup, 2 saxophones, 2 keyboards, all analog, drums, bass, and guitar. Most of the soloing is the reeds and the keyboard guys. But this is a great record. This seems to be passed over by too many, and it's really excellent. I really like it. Here's an entire artist who people don't seem to know about, and all of these records are pretty inexpensive. Emil Viklicki was the keyboard player in Energite. And I guess this is probably the most expensive of all the records of his that I'm going to show, because it has Bill Frisell on it, and Kermit Driscoll, and Vinton Johnson from Stark Reality on drums. This is a great fusion record. I mean, you can take my word for it. All original compositions, just really fabulous all the way through. I really like it a lot. This is sort of pre-restraint Frisell, so he's kind of going for it a little bit more on this than he later kind of held back the fast flurries of notes. So I really like this one. I like pre-restraint Frisell, although I love Bill Frisell's work. Been a fan for years. This record's even cheaper than that first one I showed, because it's outtakes. It's outtakes from this one, Akno. They recorded more material than would fill one record, so they put the rest of it on one side of this, and the other side solo piano, which is actually quite nice. Yeah, this is not expensive at all and worth getting. Viklicki's other records are really excellent, and the title of this one tells it all: the folk-inspired jazz piano of Emil Viklicki. And usually it's always a trio, bass, drums, and piano, plus violin and or reeds, and maybe a few other players on a few tracks. His music is more modern jazz, but it's very, very much influenced by Hungarian folk music. But it's not super avant-garde. It's not super out. It's not super weird, but it's super great. And I recommend any of these records. There's an earlier pressing of this that has a prettier cover that might set you back a little bit more. And then these are from the late 80s, early 90s, and won't set you back much at all. Both of these are excellent. There's sort of a classical vein running through these. These are very brainy sort of jazz records. Like I said, Cliquey used to be in Energy. He also worked with Jiří Stiven, who's another excellent Czechoslovakian musician, or Czech musician, I should say. And he's also a PhD mathematician who teaches mathematics at a university in Prague. It's a pretty interesting dude. Anyway, all those records are highly recommended and not expensive. I'm going to wind up in Sweden, or the Scandinavian countries. This is a real cheapie. This could be had for a few bucks. It's really an interesting record. It's Kosti Apatrea from Sama Mamas Mana and Stefan Nilsson from Cognate. I'll get to them in a second. With Jukka Tolvanen joining in on a few tracks. It's all acoustic for the most part. There is some Moog soloing on it, which is pretty cool. And there's also some percussion on it, which is pretty cool, played by either Nilsson or Apatrea. This is a really excellent album. I usually don't go for the acoustic stuff with no drums, no bass, but there's enough on this. It's dense enough and happening enough and varied enough to keep my interest. I really like this one, and it could be had for a pittance. A pittance! Apatrea's first solo record, Nispalat, might set you back a little bit more. It's an all-star fusion affair, jazz rocker to the core. The personnel on this is just mind-boggling. Stefan Nilsson again on keyboards. Ake Eriksson on drums. He was in Cornet as well. Georg Wadenius on bass. Mats Glengard from Kebnekaise on violin, and a couple of other guys too. So this is a really good record, and it won't set you back much. And it's got that great Tage Asen cover art. So I would just say that this is just a really good fusion record. Okay, speaking of, and this is where I'm going to end up, I think. I got a couple more here, but they're not all that cheap. This is a true cheapie. My record's ended, so I got to end it. This is Stefan Nilsson's solo record, De Gladys Kapell. And for some reason, this doesn't go for much either. It's just a really excellent jazz rock fusion record. The personnel, Peter Sundell on drums, really underrated and great drummer. I think he was in Egba. Georg Wadenius, again on bass, and Kosti Apatrea on guitar. Just some really smoking hot fusion from Sweden. And it could be yours for probably less than $10, not including postage. Lots of, of course, Fender Rhodes, lots of mini Moog. Just really nice, really fusion, not smooth, really good stuff. So I hope that gives you some ideas. I should say Nilsson was in this group called Cornet. I've got their albums here too. I was going to talk at length about them. They sound kind of like Pierre Morland's Gong because they're saxophone and vibes. Some of these will run you a little bit more. They're not super cheap, but this one's probably the least expensive of them all. Definitely cheaper on Discogs than on eBay. This one will cost you a little bit more. This is their first one, and this is the second one, Fritfall. This is my favorite of the batch. Anyway, Cornet, really excellent Swedish jazz rock band. Excellent, 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 and won't set you back tons of money. So there you have it. More cheap heat, imports this time, and I'll be back with more something next time. Bye.